I was sitting by the window, the silence of the late afternoon hanging heavy in the air. The sky outside was a dull grey, matching the mood that had settled over me for days. I wasn't doing anything particularly special, just staring out at the street, lost in my thoughts. That's when my phone buzzed. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, notifications from friends, spam messages. But when I saw Carl's name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. My son, the one person who should have been a constant in my life. I picked up the phone and read the message. "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that you're not invited to the family dinner this year. It's just going to be the immediate family. Hope you understand." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, staring at the screen. I read it again, hoping I'd misinterpreted it somehow. But no. The message was clear. I wasn't invited. Not to the dinner. Not to their family gathering. It was just going to be the immediate family. And I was, apparently, not a part of it. I could feel the air around me grow thick, like something heavy was pressing against my chest. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I had just read. How could this be happening? How could Carl, my own son, tell me this in such a casual, almost indifferent way? For a moment, everything went quiet. The buzz of my phone faded into the background, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I should have been angry. I should have shouted, or at least felt something. But I didn't. All I felt was this overwhelming sense of disbelief, like I had been slapped across the face. My mind raced through years of memories, all the times I had tried to be there for Carl, all the sacrifices I had made to ensure his life was better than mine. And this was the thanks I got. I couldn't help but think back to the countless family gatherings I had attended over the years. There was a time when I was at the center of it all. I had been the one everyone came to for advice, the one who held the family together when things got tough. But somewhere along the way, I had faded into the background. My calls went unanswered, my visits became less frequent, and my place at the dinner table grew smaller and smaller. This message, though, was different. It wasn't just a small thing, like missing a phone call or a family outing. This was a direct, cold reminder that I was no longer needed, no longer welcome. It was a sharp, cruel reality, and it hurt more than I could have ever imagined. I wanted to text him back, to let him know how much this hurt, to tell him that I deserved better than this. But the words stuck in my throat. What would I say? Would it even matter? I had tried so many times before, reaching out, offering love and understanding, only to be met with indifference. Would this time be any different? I doubted it. Instead of responding, I just sat there, holding the phone in my hand. I could feel the anger start to bubble up, but it wasn't the kind of anger that made me want to lash out. It was the kind of anger that comes from being ignored, from being taken for granted. It was the kind of anger that builds up over years of being overlooked and dismissed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me. The quiet moments when I felt invisible, when I was no longer a part of the family. It wasn't just Carl, it was everyone. Over time, I had stopped being the person they came to. I had stopped being the person they needed. And now, I was no longer even invited to their dinner. It was a cruel reminder of just how far I had fallen in their eyes. The question echoed in my mind. Why am I still trying? Why am I still holding on to this idea of family, this hope that things could be different? After all these years, after all the hurt, Why was I still reaching for something that wasn't even there? I put the phone down and stood up. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me. I needed air. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and walked outside. The cool breeze hit my face, and for a moment, it felt like I could breathe again. I walked slowly down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, but mostly a deep, aching sorrow. I had been a good aching sorrow. I had done everything I could for Carl, for a family, and yet here I was, alone on a quiet street, rejected without even so much as a second thought. But as I walked, something began to shift. The anger started to fade, replaced by something else, a strange sense of clarity. No one had ever told me that I didn't need to fight for a seat at the table. No one had ever said that it was okay to walk away, to stop trying when no one cared. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that this was the moment. This was the point where I had to stop waiting for them to let me in. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. This family, this dynamic, had never been healthy for me. And yet, I had kept holding on, thinking that maybe one day things would change. But now, I understood the truth. They weren't going to change. And neither was I. I didn't need to be invited. I didn't need to wait for their permission. I wasn't going to be the one who constantly begged for a place at their table. I wasn't going to be the one who kept hoping for a seat that would never be given. I wasn't going to the dinner. I wasn't going to keep fighting for a family that had already written me out of the story. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: relief. It was time to move on. It was time to stop waiting. The evening of the family dinner arrived, and though I was not invited, I could not help but feel the pull, as if some invisible force was dragging me back into the same old pattern. For days after Carl's text, I had been replaying the message in my mind, over and over, each time trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this was not a sudden shift. This had been building for years, a slow erosion of my place in their lives. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. How had it come to this? My hair, once full and vibrant, now had streaks of grey. My face showed the wear of years spent carrying the weight of responsibilities, of trying to hold everything together. But it wasn't just age that I saw in the mirror. It was the years of neglect, the quiet acceptance of being invisible. Carl's text had only been the final blow, the confirmation that I had already faded into the background of their lives. The family dinner, which I had once been a part of, felt so far removed now. I had always taken my place at the table for granted, but not anymore. I wasn't invited this year, and the hurt of it had settled deep inside, making every small interaction feel like a reminder of how much I had been pushed aside. It wasn't just Carl, it was the entire family, all of them. I had watched over the years as the relationships I had cherished slowly withered away. But tonight, something inside me shifted. I couldn't stay home, hiding from the truth. I needed to see it for myself. I had to witness what my absence would mean to them, even though I already knew the answer. It wasn't about being invited. It was about seeing the truth for what it was. So, despite the silence between us, despite the hurt that still lingered in my heart, I decided to go. I didn't plan on staying long. I just needed to understand what had happened to me, to us. I drove to their house, the familiar route feeling foreign now. As I approached, I could see the warm glow of lights spilling from the windows. Laughter and chatter echoed in the distance, a sound that once brought comfort, but tonight it felt more like a reminder of what I had lost. I parked my car a few blocks away, not wanting to be noticed, not wanting anyone to see me. I didn't even know if I was ready to see them, to face the reality of what had become of my family. Walking toward the house, I tried to calm my nerves. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the familiar anxiety creeping up inside. But I told myself I needed to be strong. I needed to see it all, to understand why they had closed the door on me so easily. I approached the window and peered inside. There they were, Carl, standing near the kitchen, holding a glass of wine. Jody was sitting at the table, her back to me, chatting with a few relatives. The scene was so familiar, yet it felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. They were happy. They were a family. And I was not a part of it anymore. I stood there, frozen in place, watching them laugh and talk as though nothing had changed. And in that moment, I realized how much I had been ignoring the truth. I wasn't wanted. Not anymore. Not by them. I was no longer a part of their world. No longer a part of their family. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth. The family dinner, the one I had once thought was a simple tradition, was no longer for me. They had moved on, and I had been left behind. A wave of sadness washed over me. But it wasn't just sadness. It was a sharp, stinging pain, the kind that comes from years of quietly accepting rejection, of being the one who always reached out, always tried to make things work. But now, as I stood there, watching them, I realized that I had been fighting a losing battle. I had been trying to be seen, to be heard, when all along, they had already made their decision. I wasn't important to them anymore. I turned away from the window, unable to watch any longer. I needed air. I needed space to breathe. I walked back to my car, my steps heavy with the weight of everything I had just seen. The drive back home was silent, the hum of the engine the only sound that accompanied my thoughts. I didn't know what I was feeling. Anger, sadness, confusion. They all blended together into a fog that clouded my mind. But amidst the confusion, something else began to surface. A quiet realization, one that I had been too afraid to acknowledge until now. I had been holding on to the idea of family, hoping that if I tried hard enough, I could make them see me, make them appreciate me. But the truth was, I had been fighting for something that wasn't mine to fight for anymore. I had been fighting for a place at a table that had long since turned its back on me. The drive back to my house was longer than usual, and by the time I arrived, the house felt strangely quiet. I didn't expect anyone to be there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in me. I walked through the door and paused, looking around. This was still my home, but it no longer felt like it belonged to me. The warmth I had once felt in this house had faded, replaced by the cold truth that I was alone in this space, just as I had been alone at the family dinner. I sat down in my favorite chair, the one by the window, and gazed out at the street. The stars were just beginning to appear in the sky, their faint light barely visible through the haze of city lights. I wondered if Carl and Jody were looking up at the same stars. I wondered if they even thought about me anymore. But then I caught myself. Why was I still thinking about them? Why was I still hoping for something that they had already made clear wasn't coming? I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep holding on to a family that didn't see me. It was time to stop trying. It was time to stop being the one who always reached out, who always tried to fix things. They had made their choice, and now I had to make mine. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I had been invisible to them for so long, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop being invisible to myself. I didn't need their approval, their love, their validation. I had spent too many years trying to prove my worth to people who didn't care. It was time to prove it to myself. I didn't need to be invited to their table. I could create my own. And this time, I wouldn't need anyone else to sit at it. The morning after the dinner, everything felt quieter. The silence in the house was heavy, almost suffocating. I woke up earlier than usual, the weight of the previous night's events lingering in the air. I hadn't gone to the dinner. I had stayed away, despite the temptation to walk in and demand to be seen. But I knew, deep down, that my decision was the right one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. I sat by the window, staring out at the world outside, as the sun began to rise. The light pierced through the blinds, casting shadows across the room. The house felt strangely still. I had always been the one who filled the silence, making the calls, sending the messages, organizing the family gatherings. But now, the silence was mine to carry. It wasn't the first time I had been alone, but it felt different this time. It wasn't just the absence of my family, it was the absence of myself. For so long, I had been living in the shadows of others, trying to fit into a space that wasn't meant for me. But this time, the silence wasn't just about being alone. It was about finally hearing myself, about giving myself the space to breathe. I had always believed that family was everything, that no matter how much I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, they would always be there. I had poured my love into them, believing that one day they would see me for who I truly was. But the truth was harder to face than I had anticipated. They hadn't seen me. They had stopped seeing me a long time ago. For years I had ignored the signs. I had convinced myself that things would get better, that the distance between us was just a phase, that one day they would come around. But last night, when Carl's message hit me, everything changed. The finality of it, the coldness, the indifference, made me realize something I had been too afraid to face. I had been living my life in the shadow of their approval, constantly seeking validation from a family that no longer valued me. As I sat by the window, the weight of the years of sacrifice began to sink in. I had given so much of myself, my time, my energy, my love, to try and make things work. But in the end, I had lost myself in the process. I had been waiting for a family that no longer existed, a family that had moved on without me. The truth was painful, but it was liberating too. I realized then that I had allowed myself to be treated like an afterthought, always chasing a place at the table that was never really mine. And for the first time I acknowledged that I had been complicit in my own mistreatment. I had tolerated the neglect, the silence, the exclusion, because I thought I had no other choice. I had sacrificed my dignity for a place at their table, a place that was never meant for me. But now, I saw that it was time to stop. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, disbelief, anger, sadness. But now, in the quiet of the morning, everything became clear. I had been so focused on trying to hold on to something that was slipping away from me. I had been so desperate to be seen, to be acknowledged, that I had forgotten how to see myself. The idea of family had always been tied to my identity. I had believed that without them, I was nothing. But now, as I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I realized that this was my opportunity to reclaim myself. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth to them, but I had forgotten to prove it to myself. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I moved through the house, I realized that everything had been centered around them: the family dinners, the calls, the visits. But now, there was nothing left. The house felt empty, but in that emptiness, there was space. Space for me. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my own needs, my own desires. I had been so focused on holding everything together for them that I had neglected my own happiness, my own well-being. I had lived for their approval, constantly sacrificing my own peace in the hopes of keeping the family intact. But now, I saw that it was time to let go. I had to stop living in the past, holding on to a family that no longer existed in the way I wanted it to. I sat down at the kitchen table and took a deep breath. There was a strange sense of calm that washed over me as I let go of the guilt, the self-doubt, and the sadness. It wasn't that I didn't love them anymore. I did, but I had to start living for myself. I had to start choosing my own happiness, my own peace. I couldn't keep waiting for them to change, to see me for who I really was. It was time to see myself. I spent the rest of the morning reflecting on everything, on the years of sacrifice, the moments of loneliness, the times I had tried to make them love me in the way I thought they should. And as I reflected, I realized that I had been enough all along. I didn't need their approval to be worthy. I didn't need their love to define my own sense of self. The realization was freeing. I wasn't invisible. I was simply choosing not to hide anymore. I had been too afraid to take control of my life, too afraid to face the truth of who I was without them. But now, I saw that I had the power to create my own path. It wouldn't be easy, and I wouldn't have all the answers right away, but I knew one thing for sure. I would no longer wait for an invitation. I would no longer wait for validation from anyone. I was enough, just as I was. The truth wasn't always pretty. It was painful, and it hurt to let go of the family I had always dreamed of. But in that pain, I found something new. I found a sense of self-worth that I had been searching for all along. I had spent too many years chasing after something that wasn't real, and now I was ready to walk away. I wasn't invisible. I was just waiting for the right moment to see myself. The morning after my realization was different. The weight of the previous days had lifted slightly, but an even heavier weight lingered in the air. Fear, anxiety, and, strangely, something else, a sense of empowerment that I had never allowed myself to feel. I had made a decision. I wasn't going to keep tolerating the neglect. I wasn't going to let Carl and the rest of the family continue to dictate my worth. This time, I was going to confront them. I was going to confront Carl, and I was going to speak my truth. I had never imagined that I would find myself here, planning to finally stand up for myself, to demand that they see me for who I really was. The idea of standing up for myself was terrifying. I ceased to stay. The fear of being rejected once again, the fear that this confrontation might shatter any remaining shred of a relationship I had left with Carl, kept me up for hours. But amidst all the anxiety, there was something else, something stronger than the fear. It was the realization that for the first time in a long time, I had control over my own life. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need anyone's approval. I was going to do this for me. For hours, I paced around the house, rehearsing what I would say. My thoughts were scattered. I didn't even know where to begin, how to capture the frustration that had been building inside me for years. But I knew one thing. I was no longer going to be passive. I was no longer going to wait for Carl or anyone else to see me. I had already spent far too many years waiting for them to see me. It was time to speak up, to say everything that had been left unsaid, to make sure Carl knew exactly how much his actions, his indifference, had hurt me. But even as I prepared, a part of me hesitated. My heart raced every time I thought about confronting him. The thought of facing Carl made my stomach churn. What if this only made things worse? What if it ended our relationship for good? The uncertainty clawed at me. But then I realized something. I had already lost him. I had lost him years ago, without even realizing it. The truth was, I wasn't the one holding on to the relationship anymore. He was. And if this conversation broke whatever fragile connection we still had, and that was a consequence I was finally ready to accept. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Carl's number. The ringtone seemed to echo in the stillness of the house, each ring dragging me closer to the confrontation I had been avoiding. When he finally picked up, I almost felt relieved. But the moment his voice came through the line, I knew this would be more difficult than I had imagined. "Hey!" Carl's voice was casual, like he didn't even realize what was coming. But I was done pretending. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, despite the knot in my stomach. "About the dinner, about everything." There was a long pause on the other end, a moment where I wondered if I had made a mistake, if he was going to hang up on me. But then his voice returned, laced with confusion. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone less friendly, more defensive now. "This has been building for years," I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You, Jody, the whole family, you've all treated me like I don't matter, and I've let it happen. But I'm not going to do that anymore. I've had enough." Carl was silent again. I could feel him trying to process my words, trying to figure out what I was talking about. But the longer he stayed quiet, the more I realized how much I had been bottling up for all these years. My frustration, my hurt, my loneliness, it was all spilling out. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mum," Carl finally said, his voice flat, almost detached. "We've talked about this before." "Talked about it?" I scoffed, incredulous. "You think a few half-hearted conversations and empty apologies fix everything? You think you can just ignore me, treat me like I'm invisible, and expect everything to be fine? Well, it's not fine, Carl. It's never been fine." I could hear him shift, could feel his defensiveness rise. "It's not like that. We've just been busy. You know how things are." "No, Carl," I snapped, not letting him get away with it. "It's not just busy. It's the constant ignoring, the exclusion. It's how you never really see me, how you've made it clear that I don't belong in your life anymore, and I can't keep pretending like it doesn't hurt." I heard Carl exhale sharply on the other end of the line. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But this is how things are now. Jody and I have our own lives, and you're not a part of that anymore. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not." The words landed like bricks. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I didn't. I had spent so many years begging for validation, for attention, that I no longer felt like I had to. I was done fighting for a place in their lives. Carl's voice cracked through the silence again. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said quietly, "but there's nothing I can do." "I'm not asking for anything, Carl," I said, my voice steadier now. "I just want you to understand that I'm not going to be invisible anymore. I'm not going to keep pretending like I'm okay with being treated this way. You've made your choice, Carl, and I've made mine. I'm done chasing after a family that doesn't want me." The silence that followed felt like a knife in the air. Carl didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to respond. And in that silence, I realized something. I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need his approval. I had been living for their acceptance for so long, but now I was learning how to live for myself. "I'll call you later," Carl muttered, the line going dead. I put the phone down slowly. It wasn't the catharsis I had hoped for. It wasn't the happy, tear-filled reconciliation I had imagined. It was just silence. But that silence, strangely enough, was what I needed. It was a release, a moment of clarity. I had spoken my truth, and no matter how painful it was, I was no longer afraid of the consequences. I looked out the window, the city lights blinking in the distance, and realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't waiting for their love anymore. I was learning how to love myself. There was a strange sense of calm that washed over me, the kind that comes when you finally let go of something that has been holding you back. For so long I had clung to the idea of family, the idea of belonging. But now, for the first time, I understood that I didn't need their approval to be worthy. I didn't need their love to define me. Carl had heard me, even if he didn't understand, and that was enough. The truth had been said. I could stop hiding now. I didn't need to fight for their love anymore. I had fought for myself, and that was the only fight that truly mattered. The silence after the confrontation with Carl was deafening. I sat in the same spot by the window, where I had spent countless hours thinking, wondering, and hoping for something I could never truly have. The phone was still in my hand, the weight of it now feeling oddly comforting. The conversation with Carl was over, but my emotions were far from settled. I had spoken my truth, but I still wasn't sure what the next step would be. What would this mean for my relationship with him? What would it mean for me? I stared at the phone for a while, as if expecting him to call back, to apologize, to make it all right again. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. The words we had exchanged hung in the air like unfinished sentences. I had stood firm, but I still wasn't sure if Carl had heard me. I had said everything I needed to say. But now, the consequences of my actions were starting to sink in. I was no longer willing to accept the role I had been playing in this family, the role of the one who always gave, who always forgave, who always tried to be seen. But what if standing firm meant losing my son for good? What if this moment, this declaration of independence, drove an even bigger wedge between us? What if the damage was irreparable? The fear gnawed at me, but this time I didn't shy away from it. I knew that standing firm meant standing alone, at least for a while. It meant choosing self-respect over familial obligation, and it meant breaking free from the constant cycle of hurt I had allowed myself to live in for far too long. I walked around the house, feeling the walls closing in on me. Everything seemed too quiet, too still. The silence I had once longed for now felt like an emptiness I couldn't fill. But as I moved from room to room, I realized something. The house wasn't empty, it was just different. It was a reflection of the changes I had made in my own life. I was no longer chasing after something that wasn't meant for me, and as much as it hurt, I knew that it was time to move on. I sat down in my favorite chair, the one by the window, and looked outside. The world beyond was bustling with life. But here, inside my home, it was just me. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace. The weight of constantly trying to make things work, trying to fit into a family that didn't have a place for me, was finally lifting. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew it had to be different from what I had been living. I had spent so many years trying to make sense of my relationship with Carl, trying to fix something that wasn't broken, just misunderstood. But now, I saw the truth. He wasn't the problem. I was. I had allowed myself to be treated poorly for too long, to tolerate being invisible, because I was afraid of being alone. I had convinced myself that family was everything, that without them, I was nothing. But in standing firm, I had come to understand that I wasn't defined by my family's approval. I was defined by my own choices, my own strength. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated for a moment, not sure if I was ready to face the outside world just yet. But then I remembered, this wasn't just about Carl. This wasn't just about family. This was about me. I had to start living for myself, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. I walked to the door and opened it. It was Ruby, a woman I had met a few months ago at the community centre. She was holding a small bouquet of flowers, a smile on her face. "I thought you could use these," she said, stepping into the house with a warmth that was immediately comforting. "How have you been? I've been thinking about you." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words until she said them. The kindness in her voice, the sincerity, struck something deep inside me. I had been so focused on what I had lost, on the empty spaces that Carl and my family had left in my life, that I had forgotten about the connections I still had. I wasn't alone. I wasn't invisible. "Thank you, Ruby," I said, taking the flowers from her hands. "I needed that more than you know." She smiled, and we sat down at the kitchen table. I told her everything, about Carl, about the dinner, about the years of trying to make things work. She listened, offering comfort and understanding, without judgment. It felt good to speak to someone who wasn't a part of the mess I had been caught in. It felt good to have someone who saw me for who I truly was, not just the person I had become for everyone else. "You've been through a lot," Ruby said, after a long pause. "But I think you're stronger than you realize. You've been standing up for yourself, even if you haven't noticed it." This conversation with Carl, that was a step toward reclaiming your life, and I think it's a step in the right direction. Her words resonated deeply with me. I hadn't realized it, but standing firm was the hardest thing I had ever done. It had taken everything out of me, my fear, my doubts, my insecurities, but in that moment I realized it had also given me something back. It had given me my power, my voice, and the freedom to live on my own terms. Ruby's visit was a reminder that there were people in my life who saw me, who valued me. It wasn't just Carl and the family that defined my worth. I had friends, they had connections, and I had a future that was mine to create. As Ruby left, she gave me a hug, and I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the same as the warmth I had once felt with my family, but it was real. It was enough. And for the first time, I felt the stirrings of hope. I didn't need Carl to validate me. I didn't need his approval. I was creating my own path now, and I wasn't looking back. That evening, I sat by the window again, this time feeling a sense of calm wash over me. The sun had set, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. I thought about what Ruby had said, about how I had already taken the first step in reclaiming my life. I had stood up for myself, no matter how difficult it was. I had spoken my truth, and even if Carl hadn't heard it, I had, and that was enough. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Carl and I would ever repair our relationship, or if I would ever have the family I had once imagined. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. I wasn't going to keep chasing after something that didn't exist. The following days passed in a blur, but there was a distinct difference in the way I approached them. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, revealing a clearer view of my life, of who I had become, and of what I was capable of. The anxiety that had clung to me for so long was still there, lurking in the background. But it didn't have the same grip it once did. The decision I had made to stand firm, to confront Carl, was still resonating within me. It was no longer just a moment of defiance. It was the beginning of something new. I began to see the things I had been ignoring for years. Little things that used to be a source of frustration, like the clutter in the house or the unfinished projects, now felt like opportunities for change. It wasn't about making everything perfect, but about reclaiming the space I had let slide. My surroundings began to reflect the internal shift I was going through. I had spent so long trying to fix things for others that I had let my own life become chaotic. But now, I was ready to take control, to make my environment as much a reflection of my newfound independence as my heart was. I started with small tasks, organizing the drawers in the kitchen, sorting through old papers and photographs that had accumulated over the years. Each small action brought a sense of accomplishment, a reminder that I was not helpless in my own life. It felt like rebuilding, like creating space for something new to grow, even if I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet. Then, one afternoon, I decided to do something entirely for myself. I signed up for a painting class at a local studio. I had always loved art, always enjoyed the process of creation, but I had put it aside for so long. It felt like another life, one that had been lost somewhere in the years I had spent focused on my family, on Carl, on keeping everything together. But that afternoon, I stood in the studio, looking at the canvas in front of me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of obligation. I felt free. The brush felt foreign in my hand at first, the strokes awkward and unsure. But as I continued, I found a rhythm, a flow that had been absent in my life for far too long. The colors came together, the shapes began to take form, and with each stroke, I felt more and more connected to myself. It wasn't just a painting. It was a symbol of reclaiming my life, of taking back the parts of myself that I had forgotten in the haze of family obligations. When I finished the painting, I sat back and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't a masterpiece. It wasn't perfect. But it didn't need to be. It was mine. It was my expression, my emotions, my voice, all laid out on a canvas. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that it was enough. I was enough. The following week, I received a message from Carl. He wanted to talk. The message was short and to the point, but the underlying tone was one of hesitation. I stared at the message for a long time. the words floating in front of me. I had already made my decision. I had already confronted him. But now, the fear crept back in. What would he say? What did he want to talk about? Was this the beginning of a reconciliation? Or was it just another round of empty words? I debated for a while. I knew that meeting him meant reopening the door to the family I had tried to step away from. But as much as I wanted to move forward, I couldn't ignore the fact that Carl was still my son. The pull of that bond was hard to deny, even after everything that had happened. But I also knew that meeting him now, after I had made such a clear stand, had to be different. This wasn't about me begging for his approval. This was about me maintaining my sense of self, my boundaries. I wasn't going to go into that meeting with the same desperation I once had. I had already found my peace. I wasn't going to lose it just to make him feel better. I arranged to meet him at a coffee shop, a neutral space where we could talk without the pressure of being at home. When I walked in, Carl was already there, sitting at a table by the window, his eyes scanning the crowd. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much, and when he saw me there was a brief flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, or regret. It was hard to tell. "Hey, Mum," he said, as I sat down. His voice was softer than it had been over the phone. "Thanks for meeting me." I nodded, not sure what to say. I wasn't going to dive straight into the emotional territory. I wanted to see where he was at before I said anything more. I wanted to hear what he had to say. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said after a moment of silence. "And I realize I haven't been fair to you. I've been so caught up in my own life that I didn't see what was happening with you. I didn't see how much I was pushing you away, and I'm sorry for that." I sat back, letting his words wash over me. It was a good apology, one that acknowledged the distance between us, but as much as I wanted to accept it fully, I couldn't help but wonder if this was enough. Was an apology enough after years of neglect? Was this the beginning of something new, or just a fleeting moment of clarity? "Thank you for saying that," I said after a long pause. "But it's not just about the apology, Carl. It's about what comes next. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not. I need to see that things are going to change, that you're really going to make an effort. I need to know that I'm not invisible anymore." Carl nodded, his expression serious now. "I understand, and I want to make it right. I know I've messed up." The words were comforting, but I knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. I needed more than just promises. I needed action. I needed consistency. It was a long road ahead, and I wasn't sure if Carl was ready to walk it with me. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope. I wasn't waiting for him to fix things. I wasn't waiting for him to come around. I was moving forward, with or without him. "I appreciate that," I said softly. "But I'm not going to settle for anything less than respect. I've already waited too long for that." The days that followed my confrontation with Carl were quiet, yet everything felt different. There was a shift in the air, a change that I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic, but I felt a sense of stillness inside me, a peace that came from knowing I had finally spoken my truth. I had taken the step I had avoided for so long, and even though Carl and I weren't where I had hoped we would be, I felt lighter. I wasn't carrying the weight of unspoken words anymore. I spent the first few days after the conversation trying to adjust to the new normal. My routine had changed. I wasn't expecting calls or messages from Carl. The silence between us was expected, but it was also oddly freeing. For the first time, I wasn't waking up to the same overwhelming feeling of rejection that had plagued me for years. Instead, I woke up each day with a small sense of hope, with the quiet confidence that I had done what needed to be done. But I couldn't completely shake the emptiness. It wasn't just about Carol. It was the realization that I had been living my life in a way that kept me dependent on others for validation. I had spent so many years trying to fit into a family that no longer had a place for me. Now, I was trying to rebuild, but it wasn't going to be easy. The aftermath of standing firm was complicated. It wasn't all peace and relief. There were still moments when I felt the weight of the years I had lost, the years spent chasing after love and acceptance from people who didn't see me. I took a long walk one afternoon, trying to clear my head. The weather was still crisp from the changing seasons, the sky a soft blue as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was a quiet walk, the kind where your thoughts can wander freely without interruption. As I walked, I thought about my past. I thought about the years I had spent trying to make things work with Carl, trying to make myself seen. I had sacrificed so much of myself in that process. And I wondered how many other parts of me had been lost along the way. But there was one thing I realized during that walk. I was no longer that person. The person who would bend over backward for validation, for approval, for a seat at the table. I had been that person for far too long, but I wasn't anymore. I had stood firm. I had spoken my truth. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, I felt like I was finally walking in the right direction. When I returned home, I knew I needed to make a change. I couldn't keep dwelling on what had happened, on the missed opportunities, on the pain of being cast aside. It was time to focus on myself. For years, I had put my family first, always prioritizing them over my own needs. But that had to end. I needed to put myself first, even if it felt uncomfortable, even if it meant making decisions that might hurt in the short term. I had already made the hard decision to stand up for myself. Now, it was time to make smaller, but just as important changes in my life. I started with the small things. I cleaned out my closet. I got rid of clothes I hadn't worn in years. I reorganized the bookshelves, donating books I had been holding on to for sentimental reasons. I was shedding the old layers of my life, the things I had held on to because I thought I had to. It wasn't just about the physical clutter. It was about letting go of the emotional clutter that had built up over the years. The more I cleaned, the more I realized how much I had been carrying around without even realizing it. The memories, the guilt, the expectations. I had been carrying all of it on my shoulders, thinking it was my responsibility to fix things, to make everything right. But it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. And as I emptied out drawers and closets, I felt lighter, more free. I took up new hobbies, things I had always wanted to do but had never made time for. I started painting, something I hadn't done in years. I picked up a guitar that had been collecting dust in the corner of the living room. I signed up for a cooking class, something I had always wanted to try but had pushed aside for family obligations. It was small, simple things, but they were my things. They were for me, not for anyone else. I also made a conscious effort to reconnect with the people who had always seen me. I reached out to friends, old and new, people who had supported me through the years and reminded me of who I was. I spent more time with Ruby, who had become a surprising source of comfort and encouragement. Her words, her kindness, had become a steady anchor for me, reminding me that I was not invisible, not to everyone. As the weeks passed, I found myself smiling more often, laughing with friends, and rediscovering parts of myself that I had long forgotten. The process was slow, but it was steady. I was rebuilding my life, brick by brick. And with each passing day, I felt more and more like the person I used to be, before I became tangled in the webs of family dynamics that had stifled me for so long. But even in the midst of my rebuilding, I couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened with Carl. The silence between us was still there. We hadn't spoken since our conversation, and while I had learned to live with it, a part of me still longed for some kind of resolution. I didn't know if Carl was capable of that resolution, or if I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something still needed to be said. One evening, I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything. The room was quiet, the kind of silence I had come to enjoy. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Carl. I had stood firm, I had spoken my truth, but what came next? Was there room for reconciliation? Was it something I even wanted anymore? I thought about the life I was creating for myself, the peace I was beginning to find. I didn't want to go back to the old patterns, to the old roles. I didn't want to be the one who kept hoping, who kept waiting for something that wasn't coming. But as I sat there, I realized something important. I didn't need Carl's approval to move forward. I didn't need his forgiveness to feel whole. The peace I had found in myself was enough. I had chosen myself, and that choice had given me the strength to move on. The past could not be undone, but it no longer had control over me. I was walking away from the pain, from the neglect, and into a future that was mine to shape. As the months passed, I found myself settling into a new rhythm. The changes I had started making were subtle, but they were profound. I had stopped waiting for Carl's validation, and that had been the hardest part of it all. It wasn't just about the family dinners or the missed phone calls anymore. It was about freeing myself from the need to be seen by them. I had spent so much of my life seeking approval from the wrong places, from people who didn't understand me or didn't care to. But now I was learning to see myself, to validate my own worth. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when I caught myself wondering what Carl was doing, if he thought about me, if he regretted the way things had unfolded between us. But then I would remember why I had made the decision I had. I wasn't chasing after someone who didn't want me in their life anymore. I wasn't clinging to a family that had moved on without me. I had chosen to move forward, to take control of my own life, and that decision was more empowering than I had ever imagined. One afternoon, as I was walking through the park, I ran into Ruby. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book, her usual calm presence radiating from her. I waved and walked over to her, feeling a sense of ease in her company. It was strange how easily I had come to rely on her. She had become a reminder of what was possible when you allowed yourself to open up to new connections, to new relationships. "Hey there," she greeted me with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" I sat down next to her, feeling the cool breeze on my face. "I'm good," I said, though the truth was, I had never felt more uncertain about where I was headed. "I'm still figuring it out, but I'm learning. I've realized that I don't need to wait for permission anymore, from anyone." Ruby looked at me with understanding, her eyes soft with empathy. "That's the hardest part, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle. "Letting go of the idea that you need anyone else to tell you you're enough. But you've done it. You've taken that step." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. For so long, I had lived for the approval of others. I had tried to be the perfect mother, the perfect daughter, the perfect wife. I had shaped myself around what others expected of me, always believing that if I gave enough, if I loved enough, they would finally see me. But now, I realized that my value didn't come from anyone else's perception. It came from me. I had found my worth, even in the silence, even in the pain. And I wasn't waiting anymore. The more I embraced this new mindset, the more my life began to shift. I found myself making new connections, reconnecting with old friends, and finally pursuing the things I had always put on hold. The hobbies, the interests, the passions, they were all waiting for me to pick them up again. I wasn't defined by my past anymore. I was creating a future that was uniquely mine. One evening, as I was cooking dinner in my kitchen, I heard the familiar sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from Carl. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I hesitated. I had spent so long avoiding these texts, avoiding the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would go back to how they were. But this time was different. I wasn't waiting for him to fix everything. I wasn't hoping that this text would somehow fill the hole I had carried for so long. I opened it. "Hey, Mum. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I'm sorry. I know I've messed up. I've been distant, and I can't take back the hurt I've caused. But I want to try. I miss you." My heart fluttered in my chest, but it wasn't the same flutter I had felt in the past. There was no desperation, no yearning for something I couldn't have. There was just a quiet understanding that this moment, this message, wasn't going to define me. I wasn't going to jump at the chance to fix things, to fall back into old patterns. I had spent so long waiting for him to come round, but now I was choosing myself. I thought about it for a moment, then typed a response. "I appreciate your apology, Carl. And I'm glad you're thinking about what I said. But I need time. I'm not the same person I was before. I'm still learning how to be okay with who I am, with or without you. I'm not sure what comes next, but I'm not going to keep waiting for something that may never happen." I hit send and felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just done. I had spent too much of my life waiting for someone else to make me whole. Now I was whole on my own. The next few days passed quietly. Carl didn't text back immediately, but I wasn't surprised. I didn't expect an instant reconciliation. I didn't expect him to fully understand where I was coming from. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need for him to. I wasn't holding my breath, waiting for his approval, waiting for him to apologize. I had already given myself the approval I needed. A few weeks later, I bumped into Carl at a local cafe. It was an unexpected meeting, but one that felt strangely calm. We sat down together, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of expectations. We talked, not as mother and son, but as two people who had been through a lot and were now trying to find their way forward. It wasn't the reunion I had once imagined, but it was real. It was honest. "I know I messed up," Carl said, his voice softer than it had been in our last conversation. "I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't know what's next, but I want to be a better son. I don't want to lose you." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "We'll see, Carl, we'll see." I wasn't waiting for him to fix things. I wasn't waiting for anything. I had found peace on my own, and that was enough. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready.